welcome. It's wonderful to see you. Don't make your visit tonight your last. We want you to come back, definitely. It's really wonderful to welcome community partners and friends to campus. One of the things that people always talk about is, this adequate view that we have. It comes up quite often, and yes, we are very fortunate to have a beautiful landscape. But to me, the most special things about this campus are our engaged students, our caring staff, outstanding faculty, and true campus community. So for the newcomers in the room, I'm going to just give you a couple of quick Avery Point facts. So we're one of 4 regional campuses around the state. Avery Point's a great option for students who are looking for small classes, personalized attention, lower cost, but still want to earn a University of Connecticut degree. Students love bragging about a lot, but some of the top things they talk about is the Student Center, where they spend a lot of time, university dining services, the vibrant campus life, our caring and compassionate community, and that we're the only regional campus with an athletic program and a vibrant waterfront program. So that's what you would hear from some of them if they were here, not off working exciting internships and really cool summer jobs. On behalf of the University of Connecticut, I would like to thank our colleagues at Connecticut College and the Mystic Noank Library for their leadership with the One Book, One Region, and also send a big thank you out to one of our faculty, Lori Wolfley, for her many years of engagement with the program. So thank you to all of those folks. Programs like One Book, One Region are such an opportunity that can bring us closer together as a community, deepen our learning, and spark conversations that will shape our shared experiences. I am fortunate that I learned at a young age the power of books, their ability to transport us to different worlds, to open our eyes to diverse perspectives, and to unite us as we connect with our human emotions. It's through the pages of books that we are often able to discover common threads that bind us, transcending boundaries and fostering a sense of empathy and understanding. I also want to extend a gratitude to the organizers, the volunteers, and supporters who have worked to bring One Book, One Region to life and through the selection of this year's book, because it reminds us that each one of us has the power to make a difference, to stand up, speak out, and create a future where no community suffers from the neglect and indifference of those in power. Definitely a lesson we try to teach our UConn students. So again, welcome to UConn Avery Point. We're glad you are here, and may the lessons from What the Eyes Don't See guide us as we pursue a more just and equitable world. Thank you. I now have the privilege of turning the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Sima Eben. She is a professor in residence in the UConn Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Maritime Studies program. She is also a Connecticut Sea Grant Research Coordinator. I could go on, but I gotta give her some time to chat too. So she's gonna share a little bit about some of what UConn is doing around water management. Sima.
Hope you can see me. Anyway, good evening. It's a really great honor and pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Lori for inviting me to say a few words. I hope you can hear me okay, Sean? And I want to thank Avery for that nice introduction. So I just wanted to start out, I've been reading the book, and according to the author, the title comes from a distilled quote from D.H. Lawrence: "The eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know." And that means that you have to know the larger context and the universe of possible causes to understand or diagnose kind of a localized issue or situation. And in the context of this book that describes, this like unfolding human health travesty in Flint, Michigan that was generated by the city's cost-saving switch to the Flint River contaminated water as a source of their drinking water for their city residents. I think there are a few things that come to mind that you need. You need to have multiple disciplinary perspectives brought to bear to understand these kind of complex situations and to kind of investigate the source. You need to understand the community, its people, its structure, its problems and context, the entire complicated big picture that exists. You need to develop rigorously designed research, and you need to build and harness a broad network of support and collaboration. And finally, you need to be reactive, adaptive, and flexible in focusing on these types of emerging problems that may be right in your community. And of course, you need to be involved. So these themes and ideas resonate with the work that's undertaken by my colleagues at the University of Connecticut, at Avery Point and beyond, and at other universities in Connecticut as well. And I just want to tell you a few of the things that my colleagues are doing, or that I'm aware of what they're doing through my role as the research coordinator at Connecticut Sea Grant, because I administer a lot of funding, research funding through that role. So one of the projects that I'm really excited about, because I actually was involved in it, happened about 2 years ago, where my maritime studies colleagues collaborated with Project Oceanology, which is a marine educational program on campus, as well as New London High School. The project was funded by the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut, always important to acknowledge your funders. And the project was called the Thames River Explorations Digital Stewardship, mostly so it had an acronym called TREADS. And this involved both my undergraduates here at Avery Point and 2 other classes from my colleague Nat Trumbull and Helen Roswadowski, as well as New London High School students. And our students, which were in marine science, history, and geography classes, explored 6 coastal sites on the Thames River that contained both environmental amenities and potential environmental hazards. And my students investigated who had used these sites over time, who continues to use them, how the uses have changed over time. They explored the histories and the stories of environmental justice and injustice that were embedded in these areas. And they asked how the distribution of these amenities or hazards, how did they overlap with the demographics of the community? Are vulnerable populations more likely to be next to environmental hazards and have less access to environmental amenities? And kind of the opposite, are wealthier neighborhoods more likely to have greater access to these amenities and less access to these hazards? And that work combined over a year of work here on campus. We went out on the Project O boat many times, and it was integrated into a really great story map, an ArcGIS story map that I can send you a link to if you're interested. At Sea Grant, as I said, that's a state-federal partnership. We're housed here in the Marine Science Building. And we have a 3-legged kind of approach to our mission. We embed research, education, and outreach into trying to protect our coasts and balance use and conservation of these areas. We work through leveraging partnerships and collaborative relationships with a really diverse suite of organizations. And so one story that popped out at me, I just heard about at our latest staff meeting. We have a new staff person, Deb Abibu, who works out of actually New Haven, but she's affiliated with the Sustainable and Resilient Community focus that we've just developed. And she's been working in Bridgeport, where they're trying to upgrade the wastewater treatment plant at the West Side plant, which is near Cedar Creek. And this wastewater treatment plant has a history of, bad smells, extremely close proximity to a neighborhood. They have not included that neighborhood in any of their design plans. There's a lack of green space and trees, and even a tragedy where an 8-year-old boy fell into one of the settling tanks and died. So my colleague has been working with this community to give them access to the resources and opportunities that will connect them to hopefully having a hand in the future of this site and where it's going, as well as a Long Island Sound environmental justice needs assessment that they're conducting. Research, I kind of scanned through the research that we've funded at Sea Grant recently. Again, our focus is really coastal and marine, so I tried to, and we have a broader mandate. We really fund researchers throughout the state of Connecticut, but I tried to focus on some of the more local research we're funding. We also work with the Long Island Sound Study, which is an EPA-funded group, and so we fund researchers from even outside of Connecticut as well through that mechanism. But recently we funded Professor Chris Perkins and Jessica Brandt, who are actually up at Storrs with the Center for Environmental Sciences and Engineering. And they're actually doing work right around here in the next bay over in Baker's Cove on PFAS, which are these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You might have heard them, they're really in the news. They're an emerging chemical of concern. And they're looking at whether these chemicals are taken up by shellfish and phytoplankton in a kind of a trophic relationship in our food webs, which may eventually get to us. So again, these are issues that are emerging. Sea Grant also was part of a national Sea Grant funded program called Contaminants of Emerging Concern. And another project was funded by that same PI, Chris Perkins, to look at similar issues down in Tweed Airport, because airports may be a source, and that's why they're actually looking at Baker's Cove, because we have a Groton, New London airport right there. So they're looking at Tweed New Haven Airport, which also has a rich subsistence fishing community. We funded researchers here at Marine Science, Evan Ward, who's the chair of our Marine Science Department, and Sandra Shumway. They've been looking at microplastics, the generation of that through aquaculture, and whether those microplastics are taken up by shellfish that we may be consuming. They're also looking to see if other organisms might serve as bioindicators, so we can get a sense of how many microplastics are in our Long Island Sound environment. And I just have to say, there are a lot. We just did a random tow off our dock this spring with my class and put it under a scope, and you could see microfibers, which are actually the residue of our clothes when we wash them, if they're made out of polyester or synthetic fabrics. These are super abundant. But what does that mean for us as high-level consumers in our marine food web, or any food web, really? We've been funding, we funded Zosha Bauman and Hans Dahm, and they looked at methylmercury uptake by zooplankton species called copepods, again, just to see, because these copepods are little zooplankton that link phytoplankton with higher trophic levels of fish that we might consume. And methylmercury is a really dangerous toxin that can cause severe human health issues if it's eaten. Hans Dahm has also been looking at red tide algal blooms to see if they're going to become more common and toxic with climate change, with warming waters. We funded right now we're funding Professor Mike Whitney, who is going to be tracking pathogen pathways and fecal bacteria patterns at beaches, public beaches that have poor water quality. One of those is Green's Harbor Beach in New London, and the other is actually, they're looking at Rocky Neck State Park in East Lyme to see if they can model what's happening to these high bacteria levels that are causing closures of those beaches, but also can cause sickness in humans. We're funding Maria Rogers, who was at UConn, but now at North Carolina State, but she has a pack of other UConn co-PIs, and she's also looking at those per and polyfluoroalkyl substances and looking at their uptake by fish. So again, that's a big focus of concern. And we funded many other PIs here, Penny Vlahos, Craig Tobias, researchers who are looking at the water in Long Island Sound, to look at dissolved oxygen, to look at, whether ocean acidification is, impacting these waters, to track warming temperatures. So they are both, they've both been working on grants on those types of things and continue. We have other organizations here at Avery Point. Anne-Marie was right, this is a great area. We have a new one that I just want to introduce you to, which is called it's a National Estuarine Research Reserve, and it's called Connecticut NER, because we like acronyms. And this group is just getting its legs on the ground, but it's going to be doing a lot of research and outreach with, the public, and so that's a really exciting new organization that has now taken the second floor of part of our marine science building, and they're sharing that also with the Connecticut, we call it CIRCA. It's the Connecticut Institute on Resilience and Climate Adaptation. And they've been focusing on getting our communities more resilient and are just introducing an environmental justice screening tool. I could go on, but I'm not going to. But right now I'm going to introduce Chris Bradley, who is the director of the Noank Mystic Library and one of the original masterminds of the One Book, One Region. So I'm going to let her take the mic, but also just say this is a great book, and I think, it's really a call to arms for all of us to be really cognizant of what's going on in our communities, even in something as boring as drinking water infrastructure, because it can really have an impact on not only us, but our most vulnerable people in our communities. So thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you, Sima. I'm here tonight standing in for the founding mother of One Book, One Region, Betty Ann Ryder, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight. But there are others of us from 21 years ago, and I'm looking at Julie Menders right in front of me, and wishing that all of the other original members, Anne is standing in the back, and Joanne over here on the side. And could you all stand up? Katie from Mitchell, and come on, just stand up, take a bow. Come on. Great, thank you. Thank you. When One Book, One Region was launched 21 years ago, community reading projects were all the rage. And the challenge was raised to us, why couldn't we do this in our corner of Connecticut? A group of librarians, educators, and community members gathered, and this group took on the challenge and figured out how to make it work with a loose organization, no funding, but lots of enthusiasm. 8 years ago, we expanded our reach when Connecticut College thankfully joined the collaboration, adding new momentum to this program. We always want to choose a book that you will enjoy reading, but over the years, the books have also been chosen to expand our horizons, spark discussion, and inform us about topics that can be timely, historical, and most often universal. Immigration, the Holocaust, the criminal justice system, coming of age, the opioid epidemic, and last year, disability rights. We've introduced both well-known and little-known authors, but each year, they and their books have helped us to reach our stated goals, to bring the community together, to discuss ideas, to broaden the appreciation of reading, and to break down barriers among people. We've sometimes struggled to find and agree on the right book, but this year's choice tackles topics that demand our attention. In the author's own words, it's the story of a breakdown in democracy, the disintegration of critical infrastructure due to inequality and austerity, environmental injustice that disproportionately affects the poor, the abandonment of civic responsibility, and our deep obligations as human beings to care and provide for one another. In addition, it's about the collapse of honesty, transparency, good government, and respect for scientific truth. A lot to ask from a book, but we have every confidence in our readers and our communities to address tough issues once again through the power of just one book. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Connecticut College's Dean of the College and an avid supporter of One Book, One Region, Dr. Erica Smith.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that lovely introduction and for that lovely overview of what we do. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's so good to see you. I also want to just say thank you for the wonderful, wonderful partnership that we have. It's my pleasure to offer welcome on behalf of Connecticut College. We've been fortunate enough to be connected with One Book, One Region since 2016. At Con, we have engaged our first-year class with the book chosen for the One Book, One Region program, and I'm pleased to share that this year, we've expanded the program to be an all-college read, broadening both the impact on our campus community and the possibilities for partnership in the regional community. For this year's selection, several subcommunities at Con have already registered excitement about the book. Students on our pre-health track, the students in our public health pathway, the students in our social justice and sustainability pathway, just to name a few. They will all be invited to read the book and engaged with Dr. Hanna-Attisha when she visits the region in September. This evening, I have the honor of introducing our featured speaker for this kickoff event, another wonderful campus partner in helping us to access the many powerful issues and facets of this book selection. Dr. Derek Turner is a professor of philosophy at Connecticut College. He teaches bioethics, environmental philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, the science and ethics of extinction, and he even developed and taught a course on the meaning of dinosaurs. Dr. Turner's research focuses on philosophical issues in historical science, especially paleontology and the earth sciences. He's interested in understanding how scientists come to know things about the deep past. His work has explored big ideas of macroevolutionary theory, historical contingency, evolutionary stasis, species selection, and the study of large-scale evolutionary trends. Past winner of both the college's King Award for Excellence in Teaching and our Rash Faculty Award for Excellence in Research, Dr. Turner is the author of Making Prehistory, Historical Science and the Scientific Realism Debate, Paleontology, A Philosophical Introduction, and most recently, Paleoaesthetics and the Practice of Paleontology. Dr. Turner has had visiting fellowships at the University of Pittsburgh's Center for Philosophy of Science, and most recently, another at the KLI in Klosterberg, Austria. He's written on a variety of topics in environmental philosophy, the ethics of radical environmental activism, the precautionary principle, NIMBY, not in my backyard, activism, as well as rewilding and de-extinction. He's also founding editor and contributor to a blog for philosophy of paleontology called Extinct. Beyond his outstanding teaching and scholarship, Dr. Turner is also our associate director of the college's Goodwin Nearing Center for the Environment. The center brings together faculty, fellows, staff, and students for the joint investigation of environmental problems. The Goodwin Nearing Center community is another group on our campus poised to engage with the book and all of the important issues it raises. So please do join me in welcoming Dr. Turner to kick us off.
Oh gosh, thanks so much, Dean Smith, for that kind introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really an honor and a privilege to be a part of the One Book, One Region program. And I just want to begin with a note of gratitude for our hosts here at UConn Avery Point. Like, what an amazing place to gather this evening, and to everyone who's contributed to the One Book, One Region program. I've known from a couple years of experience teaching first-year seminars at Connecticut College that some of the previous books that One Book, One Region has selected have been fabulous. This book this year is also just wonderful, and I'm really excited to be able to share a few thoughts about it. I'm gonna, I've tried to kind of craft my talk this evening without assuming necessarily that everyone's read the book. So if you've read the book, I hope to be able to give you a few things to think about. And if you haven't, maybe this will kind of induce you to read the book. It really, really is a fabulous book. I want to check on how to just advance the slides before. Oh, that's probably not that. Oh, it's not at the top. Okay, awesome. Oh, thank you. Also, I'm sort of self-consciously aware that I put quite a lot of text on my slides, but if you're not able to quite see the screen too well, I see a couple people leaning forwards, please don't worry about it too much. I'm gonna go through everything, and so you won't be missing much if you're not able to quite see the slides. I thought it might help to start with just a very rough overview of some of what happened in Flint, Michigan. I'm leaving a lot of things off of the timeline here, but just to share a couple of highlights. It's April 25th, 2014, that the city of Flint decided to switch its water supply from the Detroit municipal system to draw city water from the Flint River. And they did that as a cost-saving austerity measure. The decision was made by an emergency manager who was appointed by the governor of Michigan, so not an elected official who was accountable to the citizens of Flint. And there were actually multiple problems associated with that change, but the big one was that they didn't add anti-corrosives to the water, which is really a standard treatment that many municipalities use. Often they'll add phosphates to the water to prevent the water from corroding metal pipes. And so they were drawing water from the Flint River that hadn't been treated with these anti-corrosives. Citizens in Flint almost immediately began complaining about the water. I mean, they were seeing all kinds of problems with the water. And they were largely ignored by local county state officials. One really interesting detail in the story, October 13th, so some months later, General Motors stopped using Flint city water out of concern that it was going to be corrosive to some of their equipment. And that really says that folks at GM were aware of an issue. It wasn't until February, the following February 25th, 2015, that the first tests showed high lead levels in water in a residential home in Flint. And it's months after that, really September 2015, when the research really gets going. On September 24th, Dr. Hanna-Attisha, who is a pediatrician at Hurley Children's Hospital in Flint, shared her findings about lead levels in bloodstreams of children in Flint. She did that at a press conference. We'll talk a bit more about that. A few weeks after that, the city switched back to Detroit city water. That wasn't the end. It wasn't the end of the story at all. Just switching back to Detroit water didn't make the problem go away because the pipes had started to corrode. So it was a long and kind of drawn-out process to remediate things. Okay, so I'm as Dean Smith mentioned, I come at this from the disciplinary perspective of philosophy. So I thought one thing I could do tonight would be to just highlight a few philosophical issues that really jumped out at me as I read the book. So I'm going to touch on a few of these themes, maybe raise a couple questions about each one, and maybe set the stage for further discussion, conversation of book, but I want to just acknowledge that, like, probably lots of you might read the book with different questions in mind. People, approaching from different disciplinary perspectives might have very different sorts of questions that occur to them. So to start with a few reflections, even on the title of the book, What the Eyes Don't See. This connects to a really important theme in my discipline, in philosophy of science, which philosophers usually refer to as theory-ladenness of observation. The basic idea is that what you see, what the data you collect, the observations you make, is often heavily structured by background assumptions, by what are your background theoretical commitments? What do you expect to see? What do you expect to find? This is a long-standing theme in a lot of work in philosophy of science, and I thought it might be really interesting to just highlight some of the things that Dr. Hanna-Attisha points to as like factors that kept people from seeing what was going on in Flint. It's really like a complicated mix of issues, starting with the fact that you can't see lead in the water. You don't taste it, you don't smell it, you don't see it. It really, the lead in the water was really invisible. So one issue is that doctors, like Dr. Hanna-Attisha, who's a pediatrician working in Flint, they treat individual patients. And so every patient they're seeing is a population of one, and they're not necessarily seeing larger populational patterns and trends. Another issue that she discusses is that there's a lot of attention given to the risks associated with lead paint in kids. And in some moments in the story as it unfolds, you see people just kind of assuming that if infants or young kids had elevated blood lead levels, it's probably due to lead paint. And because they had one cause in mind, they weren't necessarily thinking about other possible causes. There was a steady stream of reassurances from authorities that the water was safe. People drinking a glass of city water on TV, stuff like that. Another issue that's really tragic in this case is that lead poisoning has delayed health impacts on cognitive development and other aspects of children's development. And so Dr. Hanna-Attisha kind of points to this as she wasn't seeing children coming into her practice with like acute symptoms of lead poisoning, because those health impacts of lead poisoning don't show up, for years, and so that makes it actually quite a bit tougher to kind of see what's going on. There's a lack of data sharing. This is a piece of the story that really jumped out at me. There are various moments where she requests data from county and state officials and just doesn't get responses. So data sharing is a real issue. If people don't have access to data, they're not going to be able to see patterns in the data. Another theme is what I'll call jurisdictional offloading. She reports, talking to an official here, an official there. I think there was one county health official who says, who's really interested in results about lead poisoning in children, and has all kinds of ideas about how to mitigate the risks of lead paint. But when she says, no, I'm actually worried about the water, right? The response is, well, that's not my office. That's not under our purview. It's someone else. And so if it's not your job to see something, you might be less likely to see it. There's a difficulty of ruling out other causes of downstream health problems. So, later on in life, if a young person is diagnosed with something like, say, ADHD, that might be a condition that has all kinds of different complicated causes, maybe different causes in different individuals. And did an early childhood lead exposure have something to do with that? Or was it something else in that particular case? Showing causation could be very tough. Another issue is that connects closely to issues of racial bias is something that in philosophy we often call epistemic injustice, which is what you see when you see people kind of downplaying what certain people say on account of their social positionality or identity. You just don't give weight to what people say. And that's clearly a factor here in the Flint, Michigan case, where citizens in Flint were speaking up about the water almost from the beginning and just weren't getting any traction. There are issues, I'll say a bit more about this in a minute too. There's issues with burden of evidence. So I think there's a kind of an assumption in play in this case that, oh yeah, the water is safe unless somebody comes along and provides clear evidence that it's not, right? So the burden is on anyone who wants to demonstrate harms, right? That kind of setup, that kind of placing of the burden of evidence might actually make it a little bit tougher to see the harms. Another issue is that the public health research that's required to identify the harm takes time and investment and effort. And in the meantime, there might not be any kind of clear evidence that harm is occurring. In this case, there's not much institutional support for or investment in research to identify harm. Dr. Hanna-Attisha did have support from her hospital, from colleagues at her hospital, but other public health authorities were not, were quite the opposite. We're actually pushing back against some of the research she was doing. And on that note, authorities tend to view researchers who are working to identify and document harms as troublemakers or as being inflammatory or overly alarmist or maybe attention-seeking. There are all these kind of rhetorical strategies that get used in cases like this to kind of downplay what researchers are saying. And all these things kind of come out in the book, and I think all of them, in a way, sort of work together in this case to make the health risk harder to see, is a thought. So a couple questions that we might think about. In a way, I'll admit, like reading this book kind of freaked me out. It got me thinking, like, what else aren't we seeing? Like, what else is going on in communities right now that we're not seeing because we're just not primed in the right, so we're not looking, right? Or because of some mix of these factors I just mentioned. And then maybe more constructively, how might we set up institutions to minimize the chances that people in power won't see serious public health or environmental risks? This is sort of a question about institutional design. Is there a better way to kind of set things up to mitigate some of the factors that were in play in the Flint, Michigan case? Okay, so that's one topic. Obviously, another huge issue in this case is environmental racism, environmental injustice. And here, I'm just going to read a few quotations from the book that I think are really powerful. So like I said, if you're not able to see the text, that's okay. So Hanna-Attisha writes, "In my mind, it wasn't a coincidence that DC and Flint are both places in different ways that lack adequate political representation, places where democracy is far from complete." Here she's referring to an earlier water crisis in Washington, D.C. that kind of foreshadowed some of what happened in Flint. And as I mentioned earlier, the issue in Flint is that the city was run by an emergency manager. There was an elected mayor, but the mayor wasn't the one making the decisions. And this, Hanna-Attisha points out that this issue of like cities being run by emergency managers who aren't accountable to local citizens is actually an issue in the state of Michigan that is really racially inflected. She says a large percentage of African American citizens in Michigan live in cities run by emergency managers. I think it was only like 2%, a very small percentage of white citizens in Michigan live in a similar setup in a city or town run by an emergency manager. Hanna-Attisha herself studied environmental justice, and she reflects back on this along the way. So sitting in those environmental justice classes, she says, I began to see that the environmental disparities I'd first witnessed in high school weren't random. The dirty incinerator we'd fought so hard wasn't in Grosse Pointe or Birmingham, affluent suburbs. It was in Madison Heights, one of the poorer communities in our country. So you see, this is a nice way to think about environmental justice and injustice. It has to do with how inequitably the environmental burdens and benefits are distributed. She writes, for the 100th time I wondered, is the official indifference because these are Flint kids, poor kids, black kids, kids who already have every adversity in the world piled against them? And this is an aspect of the story that I actually found kind of heartrending. She says, when we test a child for lead, which is what she was doing in her own research, she was looking at blood test results for kids being treated in her clinic. So when we test a child for lead, we're testing the child's environment. Children become the proverbial canaries in the coal mine as we use their bodies, their lives, as instruments to test the world around them. This observation that almost of necessity in this case, because no one's convinced by anything else, that they end up having to use kids almost as like a measuring instrument to see if the water, that's just, I don't know how to express kind of how wrong that is. She's really getting at that here. So a question that I think she also highlights, so I've said less about this, but she's the child of immigrants to the United States from Iraq, and she also reflects extensively on her family history and how that motivates her own science and her own activism. And she shares that in her work she has almost been kind of haunted by this photograph that her dad showed her when she was quite young of a child who had been killed by a chemical weapons attack in northern Iraq. And she has that episode kind of on her mind as she works to advocate for kids in Flint. And that kind of aspect of the book got me thinking about how the language we use to talk about these patterns of environmental racism. And a question to think about is, why are we so reluctant to use language of human rights abuse to characterize things that happen here in the US? We're often quick to use that kind of language to talk about things going on elsewhere. But water seems like a human right, if anything is. Okay. A couple more, I think, really important philosophical issues to think about. One issue, and this is one that I've thought about a bit in my own work along the way, as well as the precautionary principle. So in one really interesting part of the book, Hanna-Attisha reflects a bit on what she calls the Kehoe rule. And it's named for this guy, Kehoe, who was kind of an in-house scientist working for General Motors back in the day when there was all this discussion about leaded gasoline. Should we be using lead as an additive in gasoline? And I just put another passage from the book here. So to conclude his testimony about the safety of ethyl, Kehoe made a diabolical offer. GM would discontinue the use of tetraethyl lead immediately if it could be proven to be harmful. This established a new precedent that forced public health officials to prove harm before action could be taken. So it's a kind of approach where you assume that some change or some technology is innocent until somebody can actually provide the evidence that it's not. This has to do with kind of burden of evidence again. And she contrasts this Kehoe rule with more, what you might call a more precautionary approach. She also calls it the public health approach. The public health approach, however, is far wiser than the Keogh rule. The precautionary principle holds that that a product or chemical should be considered unsafe unless the manufacturer can prove otherwise. Right? Really, really interesting. There's a lot of literature in environmental ethics, environmental policy on the precautionary principle. It's pretty clear that one issue in the Flint water case is that the authorities who made this decision to switch the water supply were just kind of like, well, they were clearly not following the precautionary principle. It was kind of an attitude of, well, we'll switch it, and then if there's any harm done, we'll just leave it to someone to show that, right? So the Flint water crisis is one extremely important and really tragic case. But lead isn't actually the only issue where, given the way our societal institutional systems are set up, we tend to follow here in the US the Keogh rule rather than the precautionary principle. So should one lesson from the Flint water crisis be that we should adopt the precautionary approach in other policy contexts as well? How broadly should we adopt a more precautionary approach? There's so much more to say about this, but I think this is like a really rich and important issue that the book raises. Reading the book from the perspective of philosophy of science, which is kind of my home discipline, one thing that really, really struck me was some of the things that Hanna-Attisha says about her own work as a scientist. I mean, for one thing, this is a really fascinating example of science in the service of advocacy. Science out there being used to address this terrible, terrible harm that's going on. But there's another aspect to this that really jumped out at me. So this is a passage where she's reflecting on her own work. Jenny is a statistician in Hurley Children's Hospital that she's working with. The two of them are working together to analyze data, basically blood test results from kids. So she says, Jenny and I had worked on dozens of academic studies over the years, but putting together an utterly perfect and unassailable one in a matter of days, no less, was a bit of a leap. The pressure was intense. One minor error, even one that didn't affect the findings, would give critics the ammunition to undermine me. One minor error and all our efforts would be for nothing, and Flint kids would be poisoned, right? This gives a sense of like how she's experiencing the stakes of this work and the pressure to do this science extremely well without a lot in the way of resources and support, okay? But then she says something really remarkable. This implicated another scientific sin, right? Actually, I should pause here and note again, she shared her research like in a press conference, which is just an incredibly interesting feature of the story. She had initially shared the results with authorities, with I think city authorities, and said, look, you need to tell people to stop using the tap water and provide alternatives for folks in Flint. Here's the result, here's what I found. If you don't do something by, she gave a deadline, right? If you don't do something by a certain date, I'm gonna have to make these results public. The deadline passed, nothing happened, and she shared her work at a press conference. So this implicated another scientific sin, one I was nakedly guilty of. My research had not been peer-reviewed, which was highly unusual. Peer review is both an ancient and modern procedure, a way to legitimize research by independent experts prior to publication. But peer review can take months. So I knowingly skipped that step. It was academic disobedience and a risk to my reputation, but urgency called for it, right? She didn't have months, like months had already passed, infants and kids in Flint had been consuming this water for months already. She didn't have the luxury of waiting around for the peer review process, which can and does take time. So she skips that step. For me, this is really, really fascinating. I think it's completely clear that she made the right choice here. Like, her approach is eminently justified. The results needed to be shared. And yet, I think this is like a fascinating case where she's in kind of using science for advocacy. She's kind of tapping into all the epistemic authority, the cultural authority that science has, right? And then if you also ask, though, well, how come science has that authority? Why should we believe, what scientists say about things when issues are controversial? Well, a huge part of that is, the kind of safety mechanisms in science that go along with, among other things, peer review as a kind of quality control on scientific research. And so it's really fascinating to me that she makes this judgment in this situation to just go ahead and share the results, which again seems like exactly the right judgment. I do think it raises another really interesting question. So this is one case where it makes sense to, suspend the usual rules about how science is done, at least in some ways, because it's just too urgent. There's too much at stake. What might other cases look like? What exactly are the circumstances under which it would be justified to cut corners in the scientific process, for example, by sharing results publicly prior to peer review? If this is a clear case of what you might call emergency science, right, where the ordinary rules are suspended or waived temporarily, what other cases might qualify? I think there's a whole rich and interesting discussion to be had about this. This issue kind of makes me think of COVID vaccine research and other kinds of interesting cases where time is of the essence, right? So it's another place where I think the book really opens the door to some big issues. Okay, and then finally, one last question that I think is kind of interesting from a philosophical angle has to do with responsibility and how we think about issues of responsibility in a case like this. I'll spare you this. This is just a few passages from the book where she talks about the criminal indictments. One thing about the Flint case is there were over time, quite a number of officials involved in the decision-making at various points who were brought up on criminal charges. These are a couple people from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. The details, at least for setting up the question, don't matter that much. The interesting thing is there was some effort to hold particular people accountable for the decisions that got made and for some of the covering up that happened afterwards. But here's another passage from early in the book that really struck me. So she says, there are lots of villains in this story. And then she adds, the real villains are the ongoing effects of racism, inequality, greed, anti-intellectualism, and even laissez-faire neoliberal capitalism. These are powerful forces most of us don't notice and don't want to. These villains poisoned Flint with policy. Okay? And so I think one interesting thing here is the kind of different ways of thinking about attributing responsibility, focusing on individual actors, who did what, who made which bad decisions when, who was negligent in what ways, at which moment in the story, and then thinking about these bigger structural culprits, if you want to put it that way. So a couple questions about this. How should we apportion causal, legal, moral responsibility for a complex event with multiple contributing causes. This actually, I should mention, there's a whole literature in philosophy of science that's kind of on this issue. Philosophers talk about the problem of causal selection. So if you have a tragic event, a car accident or something like that, and there might have been multiple causal considerations involved, bad weather, slippery driving conditions, someone was texting, who knows what factors could be involved. How do you figure out which was the cause? Because for all kinds of purposes, we might want to know, what was actually the cause of the event. So this is an issue, how to figure out, or even whether it always makes sense to talk about an event having a single cause is kind of an issue that philosophers of science have been interested in. And I think it's very much a real one here in the Flint water crisis. And then kind of a bigger question, how should we balance our assessment of the behavior of individual bad actors with the understanding that what happened in Flint was the result of structural factors for which responsibility is widely dispersed and shared? I mean, we're all responsible for the kinds of structural issues that contributed to the Flint water crisis. And so it's kind of a question of how do we hold those thoughts in mind at the same time? Holding particular actors accountable for their role while also keeping an eye on some of the larger structural questions. So those are just, like I said, a few philosophical issues the book raised for me. It really is an amazing book. It very much worth actually a really careful study. I think there's a lot here for us to think about and discuss. So thanks to all of you. I am happy, if there's time, I don't know about time, if there's time, I'm happy to hang out and have a little discussion here this evening too. Great, so thanks. I don't know. Yeah, question? Sure.
Is in no way boring. The author does such a beautiful job of bringing you into her immigrant story that you really care about her. She brings you into the stories of her various nations. She does what a lot of good literature does. She tells you about characters that you care about. It is a very readable book. And you added a whole new layer of so many things I haven't thought about that I really need to go back and reread this book. Just yesterday there was a small article in the paper, and a artificial sweetener, began with an A, was a government agency declared it probably unsafe. And I had this discussion with, I won't name who, but we had different views as to should you get a warning that has the word probably in it. I felt like, whatever, a pregnant woman, someone who might be shortly diabetic, that you would want that warning with the word probably. But I'm old enough that I remember how everyone embraced the Salk vaccine. And no one questioned that there weren't any long-term studies about the possible side effects of that vaccine. And it was so different because we saw how demonized the science was when the COVID vaccine came out. This is a different world. It gives us a lot to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I did. You should absolutely read and enjoy the book, because there's so much in the book that I didn't even touch on at all, including her personal and family story. I haven't really said much about that. It is really wonderful. If I could recommend another book, kind of in the neighborhood, there's a fantastic book by a philosopher named Karl Cranor, Cranor. It's called Legally Poisoned. And it's about Well, it has to do with the stuff about the Kehoe rule and the precautionary principle, and how there's so many consumer products here in the U.S. That companies just use synthetic chemicals of various sort, and there's no legal requirement to kind of test things for safety ahead of time. This is it's really all over the place that we're exposed to chemicals that may or may not be having health impacts. It's really, really interesting to think about. Yeah, thank you. Question, yeah.
I just want to reference your last causes.
Oh, yeah.
It makes me think of chaos there.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay? So one evening, I'm coming home from babysitting my children
Yeah.
on a snowy night. Another town at that time, and then we come around the curve on 95. In other words, all of these conditions came together to cause that accident. So it's multifaceted, the causes of that. And then secondly, I want to ask, did she ever go to the EPA?
Yeah. Yeah. I totally, on the last point, I have to kind of dig into the book on this. It's really, really interesting. She first, I hope I get this right, she first learned about the possibility that there might be lead in the water from an old friend who worked at the EPA and who just dropped the hint at a backyard gathering. It's so interesting. And yet, in other ways, there are lots of failures in the EPA. So the role of, it's a fantastic question, and the role of the EPA is really important here. On your first thought is also, it really gets at something that I thought about a lot as I was reading the book. So as Dean Smith mentioned earlier on, one of my interests is in questions about contingency. And contingency. And in philosophy, in the areas that I work on, what people mean by that typically is sometimes a really small difference. Some small thing happening a little differently up here can actually have a huge downstream impact. It is actually kind of related to ideas from chaos theory and stuff. And I do kind of wonder if that concept can help think about tragedies like what happened in Flint. Are there cases where, well, I mean, in this case, it's a pretty big decision to switch the water supply. We should be really clear about that. But could there have been other factors where maybe if something had been just a little bit different, maybe things would have worked out differently? Maybe harms wouldn't have been so severe. I think that's really a question worth asking. Yeah, thanks. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Question. A philosopher who is talking to us. The question of a witness, person who has no involvement, but reads the book, or why did she write the book? So that we would all be witness. So now what? Maybe it's your downstream thing that, what little things we can do, but I'm thinking that the responsibility of a witness is more than we think, but I'm not sure where it goes.
Yeah. It's such a great point. Actually, one interesting thing to consider maybe is the way in which the book itself might be continuous with her activism and advocacy for kids in Flint, and she's thinking beyond Flint, with the book, and actually, you put it perfectly as putting us in the position of having witnessed what happened, and now we have to go forward from there. Yeah. Good.
I just wanted to make note that we'll be at Connecticut on September 20th, and between now and then, your local libraries are holding book discussions, and everything is on the One Book, One Region website. So all the book discussions in the area and all the coordinating programs will be listed there. And thank you for having an opportunity to meet her and comment on September 20th.
Thank you